If I could ask everyone to take a seat. I want to welcome everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Carol Lavallo. I'm the Dean of the School of Professional and Extended Studies. And I'm delighted to welcome an incredible panel of in-house and external experts this afternoon to continue a conversation that Hadar Harris and I started some time ago about how do we take human rights teaching across the entire university and beyond, and really think of this not as something that only human rights lawyers do or only human rights scholars do, but that human rights truly is for everyone and is relevant to everything that we do. And so I just very briefly want to introduce our panel, and I'm then going to hand off to my colleague in the School of Professional Extended Studies, Eleftherios Michael, who will be moderating the discussion this afternoon. And we welcome all of your input. There are many of you who have as much, if not more, expertise than we do up front, so we hope that we will have at least a few minutes. We don't have much time, but a few minutes of conversation. You have handouts on your chairs telling you who everyone is, in case you don't know, so I'm not going to go into great detail on everyone, but we're going to start off with Eleftherios Michael, who's the Associate Dean of Faculty Affairs in the School of Professional and Extended Studies and a Professor of Peace and Conflict Resolution. We then will move on to Hadar Harris, who is an international human rights attorney and also is the director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law at the Law School. We then will come back to this end and turn it over to Jeff Bachman from the School of International Relations, teaches human rights at SIS, School of International Service. Sorry, my oldest university was School of International Relations. Then move to Rick Rockwell of the School of Communication. We'll talk a little bit also about practical training, practitioners training in human rights. And we will finish up with Linda Bishai, who is at Senior Program Officer at actually, am I getting your title right? Yes, Senior Program Officer at the U.S. Institute of Peace, my former employer, and she has been doing incredible work on human rights teaching in the field, most recently in, or for quite a number of years actually, in Juba and South Sudan. We won't hold it against her, and they're having a little bit of a challenge right now, but it provides us with an opportunity to look at how do we take human rights from academia into the field. So thank you very much. Without further ado, Eleftherios.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, dear colleagues and all of us. I'm supposed to be wearing multiple hats today, but I feel kind of cold up here. I don't know why still. I think it has to do with the genetics. Am I assuming I'm the least qualified person to be here because A, I don't have a law degree, and B, I have two little kids in the house that ask me what am I going to do today, and I said I'm going to give a talk for 2 minutes, and I promised to them that I'm going to keep it short so I can go home and see them sometimes 5:30 by 5:30. So I'm not going to keep my comments long, very short. I'm also going to be keeping the time so my colleagues stay within the 7-8 minutes that we allocated. If you allow me, I want to take a couple of minutes and talk to you a little bit about how a person like me who's coming from a conflict analysis, conflict resolution background can integrate human rights knowledge, human rights theory into teaching. And to be honest, I spent about 7-8 minutes thinking about it, and then I ended up coming up with a little map which I think I want to share with you. It's just a little map. If I can ask a colleague to circulate it, it's an example of how a person like me with my background can focus on one of the themes, in this case post-conflict development, and integrate human rights knowledge into that teaching. And students get some of this exposure. As the map is circulating, I promise that I am not going to elaborate on any of these points, but this is simply to demonstrate how topics such as truth commissions, truth and reconciliation can be incorporated. Lawyers and folks in the field can study truth and reconciliation commissions, can focus on the language and the logistics of it, and that's the wealth of knowledge we have, which we can then integrate into our own teachings. And these are examples where students, at least in my class, can get a good exposure of what's like to be in a truth commission, what's like to be in South Africa and participating in one of those, or Rwanda. I see a colleague who was involved in northern Ireland, or the 6 counties, as some folks call it. And that's another topic I have here, on the commissioning. How do you put in guns beyond use? And following the Good Friday Agreement in 1997-98, decommissioning became one of the topics. Leading experts and lawyers were involved in the making of those agreements as well, the Good Friday Agreement, or jumping from the Good Friday Agreement to the Dayton Peace Accord. Soon we're going to have the 20-year anniversary of the Dayton Accords. And all of this can be integrated into a classroom. And in addition to the literature that we get from all of you, and I'm going to conclude with this, we can then invite experts, such as Linda Mishai was in my class a few weeks back before winter break, speaking to my students about South Sudan and the transitions in South Sudan. We can also take the students to various organizations, visit the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and talk about the logisticals and the legal aspects of the Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking process. I think I spoke a lot. Again, this is only for the demonstration to highlight how a few themes can be incorporated into classrooms, into teachings. All of this knowledge is coming from colleagues on this panel, so I'm going to pass on the time to my colleagues to tell you more about how this can happen, so how you can go about to incorporate some of this knowledge into your own teachings. So thank you for allowing Father Rabai's recommendation. I think we can jump to that.
Thank you. First, I want to say thank you to you all for being here late on Friday afternoon after a long and I'm sure intensive day of learning and talking about teaching. It's a hard slot to fill. This is worse than the right after lunch slot, I think. But we're gratified to see so many of you here, as well as so many familiar faces who I'm surprised want to hear it again, but we're happy to have you here. I want to thank Dean Weil for her enthusiastic embrace and partnership in this endeavor of trying to really catalyze human rights at American University in so many dimensions. Part of what we're trying to focus on, and our center is working across the university with Joe Eldridge, with the deans of all the schools, to really try to bring human rights to the forefront as one of our unique added values at this institution, and think about how we can catalyze students, think about how we can catalyze faculty, how we can do that with both faculty and students together. And it's been my great pleasure to work with Dean Weil, also with Rick Rockwell, everybody does that, don't they?
Yes.
Yeah. Jeff Bachman, and so many others across the campus to kind of move this forward. So I wanted to spend a couple of minutes of my time talking about really what is human rights education, what are we talking about here, and 3 different ways to look at how we might engage and embark on teaching human rights in a variety of different methods. Already straight from my notes, it's pretty awesome. So the United Nations defines human rights education as training, dissemination, and information efforts. You can already tell that it's the United Nations. Training, dissemination, and information efforts aimed at the building of a universal culture of human rights through the imparting of knowledge and skills and the molding of attitudes which are directed to strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, full development of the human personality and sense of dignity, promotion of understanding, respect, gender equality, and friendship among all nations. That's great human stuff. Indigenous peoples and racial, national, ethnic, religious, and linguistic groups, and enabling all people to participate effectively in a free society. A comprehensive education in human rights not only provides knowledge about human rights and the mechanisms to protect them, but also imparts the skills needed to promote, defend, and apply human rights in daily life. Both what is taught and the way it is taught should reflect human rights values, encourage participation, and foster a learning environment free from want and fear. So, let's take that back for a second. Knowledge about human rights, mechanisms to protect them, and skills to promote, defend, and apply human rights in daily life. It's an ongoing and lifelong process of both teaching and of learning. And that may be one of the key cruxes of what we talk about when we're talking about how to integrate human rights into our teaching. It's both teaching and learning. So how does it relate to what we're doing here today? I think it does on 3 levels. One is the substance of what you might teach. One is the pedagogic devices that you might use to teach. And the third is how you walk the walk in your classroom, the way in which you teach, and how you structure your course or your classes. So I've got 6 minutes, generously.
That was 4 minutes.
That was 4 minutes ago? Okay. So first substance, what are human rights? What are human rights? The way that we broadly define human rights are the rights that all people have by virtue of being human beings, right? Very general, very broad definition. You can roll all kinds of things into that. It basically comes down to the first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which if anybody knows me knows that I like to quote this all the time. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Everything else comes from that when we're talking about teaching human rights and living human rights. So it can mean many things to many people, and obviously the clearest starting points for many people is to say, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't actually teach about human rights, and I can't actually integrate human rights into the classroom. And please don't tell anybody at the law school that I'm going to say this, but so what? That's fine. Because human rights don't belong to lawyers. Human rights law in some ways may, because they can deconstruct really obtuse language from United Nations Security Council resolutions and things like that. They can go to international criminal tribunals and talk about the Rome Statute, but it's not owned by the lawyers. And in fact, for human rights to be real, it can't be, and it must not be. And as teachers, you can't defer to the law school to teach human rights. Human rights needs to be integrated into everything that we are doing. And that is not only talking about the School of International Service or communications, but it's like an event that we had a few months ago about the human rights implications of psychiatric diagnoses, right? So, School of Public Health, we don't have School of Public Health, but public health or psychology, various fields like that. Climate change in human rights, something I personally am extremely interested in. Right? It has implications for everyone at every level, and there are points of entry for the substance at all levels. It's about thinking about how your discipline actually relates to that quest for equality and human dignity, that quest for respect and human dignity, and finding the linkages. So, teaching human rights is not about law. It needs to include law. I am going to say that. I believe that it should include law. There should be some reference to the fact that there are legal structures, there are binding treaties and things like that, but it can't only be defined that way. And what we do over at the law school is to try to also broaden our approach to integrate other ways of looking at legal obligation to ensure that what we're talking about is not just a de jure legal analysis, but actually looking at how law is implemented and operationalized and realized on the ground. So our challenge of teaching human rights is to teach it holistically. The second topic I want to talk about was pedagogic devices, and you're going to hear a lot more of that from the other speakers. So I know that Jeff and Rick are going to talk about different ways that they integrate human rights into their classrooms, and there are a lot of different kinds of tools. One thing I like to do when I'm talking to undergraduate students or even high school students is to take a newspaper, the physical, actual thing that you get newsprint on your hand. So first of all, it's an educational experience because they've never seen one. You can say to them, this is old school, this is what a book looks like, this is what a newspaper looks like. We used to get news this way. And ask them to find human rights issues in the newspaper. You don't even have to look at the newspaper first. Give them the sports section, and they will find human rights issues in it. It's a great way to start a conversation. You can have simulations. You can have, as was mentioned before, simulations of the indictment of a head of state, who's responsible for genocide, things like that. Case studies, the stories of human rights defenders that are very powerful as starting points for talking about different kinds of issues. You can use site visits, as was talked about. We're sitting here in Washington, D.C. Every year we start our semester, our academic year, with a trip down to the Holocaust Museum. And it's not for credit, it's not part of a class, it's something that we take law students, and we will next year invite the full campus to come with us down to the Holocaust Museum because we believe that it's a very important starting point every year, all the time. Using local experts, as we talked about. Using Skype to bring there here, and also to acknowledge that there is not the only story of human rights. When we're talking about human rights, there are pressing human rights issues in this country, in this neighborhood, in this city for sure, that can and need to be explored. And so that may be your starting point also, is in talking about that. Finally, the last point that I want to talk about is how we create a human rights culture in the classroom. What I said about walking the walk. Often, we as educators tend to observe the sort of built-in hierarchy in a classroom. We're the teachers, we're the experts, they're the students, they gotta learn from us. Now, part of that's built in because we give the grades. And so no matter what, there's going to be that sort of power dynamic in a classroom because ultimately we decide their fate in some way or another, right? But many of us try to break this down, and fundamentally it's difficult, if not impossible because of what I just said. But there are ways to create and to reinforce a human rights ethic in your classroom. I brought a copy, we're going to just keep passing things out. I brought a variety of different materials, but about some of the human rights work that the center does on human rights education. But can I have one copy of that? We just talked about it yesterday. But a document that is a set of human rights principles that our center has developed for the working of our center. Now, it's different than a set of human rights principles that you might undertake for your classroom, but I pass this out because it underscores certain fundamental human rights principles of respect, of participatory and inclusive behavior, of transparency, of solidarity, of honesty and accountability. Now, the way that these are written are for the running of our organization. We review these every few months in our organization to see if we really are walking the walk. But it would be something that you could develop in your classroom at the start with your students as baseline agreements for your class, which could really transform the way in which you think about your teaching and they think about their learning. Just as a final concluding thought, again, at the beginning I talked about both teaching and learning. There is so much to be learned, and we know in the academic world that we are continuously learning all the time. In terms of human rights and in terms of this undertaking to really promote dignity and respect and a culture of rights, it is a constant, evolving, and very difficult undertaking. But there are very easy ways at a minimal or at a very large level to integrate it into your classrooms. So again, I thank you for putting this panel together, for giving me an opportunity to share some thoughts and to set the stage again. We have 3 stage setting presentations at the beginning, and look forward to hearing from my colleagues about the way to really take that and run with it. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you to the deans for setting this up. So, I mean, ultimately I want to talk about how human rights can be integrated into classes outside of, say, SIS. You know, it's relatively easy for me. I've taught, I think, 5 different courses since I started here, and at least 4 of them have human rights in the title, so it's already sort of built into the class. But to frame the discussion, I just wanted to talk briefly about a study carried out in the 60s by Lawrence Kohlberg. Are any of you familiar with the Heinz dilemma? So the Heinz dilemma involves, so Kohlberg was looking to measure moral development, and he took adolescent boys and he gave them this hypothetical situation where this man Heinz, his wife was dying, and there was a doctor who had developed, not really a cure, but something that would mask the symptoms that would take care of his wife temporarily. And you know, Heinz could not raise the money. He went to the doctor and said, "I'll pay half now, I'll pay more later." The doctor refused, and so the boys were asked, should he steal the medicine? And the boys typically responded, you know, generally with a creation of like a hierarchy of rights. And so the right to property was seen as less important to the right to life, so therefore Heinz was justified in stealing the medicine. But so then Carol Gilligan comes along and says, well, you know, you're using this to generalize for all adolescents, but you didn't ask any girls to answer the question. And so she carries out the same study, thank you, and again, generally speaking, the girls came up with, or described a narrative of relationships, and so essentially almost creating a web. And their arguments for not stealing the medicine typically revolved around, if he steals the medicine, it's going to fracture this relationship, and it'll have implications further down the road. Maybe the husband ends up in jail, maybe the doctor refuses to sell it to him next time because he stole it the first time. And the reason I bring this up, and you know what this has to do with, I think, teaching human rights across disciplines is, if we look beyond, I don't want to say that human rights issues are not, you know, present in the immediate effects of decisions, policies, etc. But if we look beyond into the ripple effects of decisions that are made, ultimately, you know, human rights are affected, and there are implications, whether it's a positive act or an act of omission. And so the other thing I just wanted to mention briefly is the importance of ethics. If we incorporate ethical considerations into the classroom and our studies, it inevitably requires addressing human rights impact of whatever the decision is, whether it be, you know, policy action, omission, an investment, an invention, a technological advancement, etc. Human rights become part of the conversation. So what I'd like to do is, I'm going to use drones as an example of something that can be used in a classroom across disciplines, primarily because it's something I've been focusing heavily on the last few years. And so, in my first year seminar, I teach a first year seminar for SAS called Counterterrorism and Human Rights, and we talk extensively about drones and the targeted killing program. I had students write a policy brief where they measure the impact of drones and make arguments on both sides from a moral perspective, legal perspective, and an efficacy perspective. And then ultimately they come to a recommendation, should we continue, terminate, or reform the policy? So that's easy again, right? Counterterrorism and human rights, it seems easy to bring drones into that discussion. But I also included drones in my human rights in the media class. Dirty Wars was one of the human rights film series films, so it made sense in that context. But this was a class across the School of Communications, and students researched the New York Times coverage of drone strikes to see whether the New York Times is actually incorporating into their coverage of the stories human rights language, humanitarian law language, and probably not surprisingly, they found very little, if any, discussion of human rights or humanitarian law within this. And the New York Times is arguably considered one of the papers that has done a decent job of covering the drone strikes. So, again, pretty easy for me to bring that into the class, but I was thinking, what if we take a literature class? If I wanted to incorporate a current human rights issue, in this case drones, into literature class, maybe I would assign, and not that it has to work in this order, maybe you assign the stories and think about the rights issues that can accompany the stories, but I could assign Kurt Vonnegut's Cat's Cradle. Of course, Vonnegut targets a number of different topics, but he also ridicules the arms race, and This could then lead to a discussion of issues related to the use and proliferation of drone technology. Military spending impacts economic rights, of course. You know, we always hear the talk, well, if we weren't spending all this money on war, we could be spending it on poverty. Whether or not that would actually happen, I guess, is a different discussion. But nonetheless, military spending does impact economic rights. And more obviously, both the Cold War arms race that Vonnegut tackles and the current arms race we are witnessing have significant impacts on the human right to life. So also consider how drones and human rights can be incorporated in classes on business and the environment. Some of you may be familiar with the Enough Project. The Enough Project draws attention to the exploitation of minerals in the DRC and how these resources are used in the production of many of our favorite electronic devices. But these minerals are also used in the production of drones. So, for example, tantalum, and I'm not a scientist, so I hope you won't ask me any questions on all this, but tantalum is used in the production of drones. It can be found in coltan. Coltan is mined in the DRC. Who else mines coltan? Children, so you have children's rights issues. The mining also contributes to conflict in the DRC, so there's much broader, wide-ranging issues, women's rights issues with rape and other things happening in the DRC. And Central Africa more broadly, sorry. Coltan is also highly toxic and is hand-mined. This can lead to water contamination, which has potential effects on the entire local ecosystem. Forests are sometimes cleared. So we have corporate social responsibility issues connected to the corporations that oversee the mining as well as the production of drones. We have environmental issues I noted above, which have a significant impact on a number of human rights. And finally, to bring public policy, SPA say into the mix, pretty much everything mentioned from the counterterrorism and human rights class that I talked about to the environmental issues, all these are parts of the broader national security policy talks and discussions in the use of drones. So, just want to make a quick note on connecting experiential learning. So we do live in DC, and it is a luxury, I think, that provides opportunities. During my counterterrorism and human rights class, we were talking about indefinite detention at Guantanamo Bay, the force feeding, and at the time, it happened to be during class time on a Friday. It turned out that the District DC Court of Appeals was having a hearing on jurisdiction over for an injunction against the force feeding. Took the students down there. And a lot of the feedback I got, it was one of the favorite things of their first semester, first year, and certainly as part of my class. But I also require students in my human rights classes to complete a campaign or some other active assignment that encourages engagement with issues they're passionate about. I believe the study of human rights and activism to be inextricably intertwined. To spend a semester discussing the problems the world faces without discussing ways to be part of the solution just doesn't make sense to me. So students in my intro to human rights class do a campaign. Most recently when I taught it, they split into two groups. One group took Human Rights Watch's Red Hands campaign and did their own on campus, created a sheet, had students, they hung out in MDC, had talked to students about the conflict, had them dip their hand in whatever it was, some form of red something, I don't think it was actually paint, but and then put it on the sheet. The other half of the class created a photo essay on the human rights issues in Bahrain to draw attention to both the issues in Bahrain but also the United States connection to the Bahraini monarchy. My human rights in the media class produced podcasts, so they had to attend the film series and to sort of continue the discussion after the films ended. They created podcasts which were posted on AU's iTunes account, and they also actually created their own web page where they posted blogs, they posted their podcasts, and they created a mini documentary that's sort of to celebrate the 65th anniversary of the UHR, which was just in December, while also giving some critical responses to the UHR as well. In a way, these types of assignments bring respect for human rights into the classroom, as Dara was talking about. It gives students room to be creative and empower students to give them ownership and a stake in the class. So, lastly, I just want to conclude by emphasizing the importance of being passionate about the integration of human rights. Human rights issues, even though they are treated, I think, in this way, and sometimes, especially in academia, do not occur in a vacuum. To be freely studied as if detached from reality. These affect real people's lives. One of my favorite comments I've received in student evaluations is when a student referred to my introduction to human rights course as dynamic. I'm a pretty intense person, so I try and kind of keep it low-key. So I was really happy to see that kind of powerful description of the learning environment and that experience. students are, as you know, quite perceptive, and if they get the feeling that you're not really into it and really engaged with it, they will perhaps feel they don't need to be also.
Thank you, Jim.
I want to start by thanking everybody for coming too on Friday. I'm sorry to be repetitious, but I just need to say those thank yous, and thank you to the deans for the invitation and Hadar for asking me to be here. Also, thanks to my colleagues who've done some really great presentations already. I'm really impressed by what they have to say, and sitting here taking notes. I think that stresses a point that I happen to be invited to the panel here, but I work on a campus with so many people who are qualified to be up here that I just want to say I'm coming at this as a peer, not as a panelist, and happy to discuss it along those lines. I'm so. Now, call from outside.
That's like the newspaper. It's a telephone ringing.
It's the UN for you, right?
Hello?
Let me just say that
Great.
I think it's a great compliment to be next to this professor I've never met before, and I'm glad I've learned so much just in the past 5 minutes from him. But I want to say there's some serendipity at work here, because I have taught more than 20 courses in my time here at the university, and not one of them has human rights in the title. And so the challenge to me is, as somebody who cares about these things, how do I find a way to make a course work to meet this agenda? And I can't always do it, and because obviously there's some things that must be taught in certain courses and curricula that must be addressed. But I think there are creative ways to infuse, and we've heard several ideas already, so I'll try not to repeat those. But I will talk, I think, a little bit more about the pedagogical devices rather than substance, because we've covered substance so well. Only one of those courses I've taught is an ethics course. So ethics, of course, lends itself right away, I think, to human rights and in dealing with those sorts of things. So some of this is the politics, the internal politics of trying to get assigned to those courses, or trying to talk to the department heads about how can I steer a course a little bit to this way that can do that. I think you have to be willing to do those things, and that's not necessarily your work with students. That's your work with administrators and others that I think is important to this particular theme. That if you care about this theme, you have to be brave enough to change your syllabus, go down and make those things. And I don't have any of those particular dramatic examples like that to do, but obviously the assignments to write specific papers on specific case studies, to create productions, because I teach a lot of news production, both print, web, and multimedia. So there can always be an assignment that says we're going to focus on a particular human rights theme. I might be very broad. One of the broad themes that I find is very useful and is my specialty area to write about is free speech. And so free speech applies. You can find free speech cases here in DC. You can find free speech cases in Latin America, where I tend to do most of my work, but totally globally, for those who are very focused on particular regions, and many of our students are very interested in very specific regions of the world, free speech cuts across all those areas, and so I would suggest that is a thematic area. So to the pedagogical devices, I'm glad Hadar mentioned Skype. I think we found Skype is a way to globalize your class, and not only to bring experts about human rights into the classroom, but also to take on projects that deal with this. Some folks know I like to work in post-conflict societies. That's my area with media. And so one of the things we've done with our joint degree program with SIS this past fall is work with journalists in Kabul about how to report in a post-conflict society about human rights issues, about corruption, about things that are fairly dangerous for reporters to be doing in Afghanistan. And we held 15 different sessions with these journalists and our students here on this end, 30 journalists who were our students for these sessions in Kabul. And I think I just received a note from one of those students last night saying this was a tremendous way to open our eyes to how we can use different mechanisms. But it was also a way for us, just in holding these Skype sessions with some basic PowerPoints, to bring our students from this joint degree program in, for them to see how you can create a project that doesn't have human rights in the title, but the foundation of it is definitively about what this is. So those are some of the things that I've done in the past. I know I'm running out of time, so I'll be really quick here. Instead of the big legal tones, and I'm glad that Hadar said what she said about the legal part. Okay, sorry, it's off the record. I'm old-fashioned too. I like the magazine approach. These are some magazines. This one on human rights. This one on post-conflict society in Guatemala. There's really short articles, not to assign the whole thing, but just a few, and let students really. Then it becomes less daunting for them. Especially students who are undergraduate students, where they feel like this is really heavy topic matter. If you can break it down to the simplest piece, then assigning short readings, short web pieces of work, and then short writing for them, I think, is often the way that is the building block. Then if you can light the fire, then maybe the 20-page paper, the 25-page paper, at the end of the semester, you build to that. And those that you've lit up, they can pick to do a big topic on those particular areas. Finally, I'm glad you mentioned podcasts. We also do a bit of a podcast project on Latin America. We have 35 different episodes that are in the university library right now that are on human rights topics. We don't cover human rights every week on this particular project. We've been doing this project for 2.5 years, but I use those in classes not to take the place of reading, but to supplement reading. Students tell me often it's really easy to listen to something for a half an hour rather than reading something for that same period of time. They can actually do that while they're doing something else, but they can be engaged on a human rights topic that they're listening to while something else is going on. So assigning some of those things, and that's part of the reason that I built this podcast project, was I could infuse it into courses and not have them listen every week, but just to specific topics that meet the topic of the course on that particular week. And I think I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for getting me out of my office. Chaotic and horrible day. It is a pleasure to be here, despite USIP's beautiful space and everyone is jealous of us. We do like to get out of the building every now and then. I actually want to talk a little bit about a project I did a number of years ago. My current work in South Sudan and Sudan, although all of our work is a little bit human rights related, very frequently it's not explicitly human rights, because the governments where we operate don't want to hear that phrase, and certainly don't think that we should be coming in and doing anything about it. So in many cases we're doing other sorts of work. So I'm doing work with the police in South Sudan, or I was, until it's no longer clear what I'll be able to do. But in any case, the project I want to talk to you a little bit about, and then swing back around to what I think would make sense for American classrooms, is some work I did a number of years ago with a colleague on teaching human rights in Iraqi university classrooms. And this was a particularly unique situation because the post-invasion new Iraqi government wanted to make human rights courses mandatory in universities. But as you might imagine, under Saddam Hussein, those classes had never been taught. And so you had a very small handful of political science and law professors who knew the content, and almost no one else who knew the content, and it hadn't been taught in years. So it was very quickly sank to the bottom of the desirable list of courses that professors wanted to teach, A, because no one knew the content, and B, because no one felt like it was really relevant to their violent lives. And the students didn't respect the content, they didn't respect the material, it was a required course, they had to be there, they weren't interested in taking it. and the professors really hated the fact that they had drawn the short straw and had to teach it. And many of the professors had no content knowledge. We had a few professors in our selected group who did have that political science and law background, but we also had mathematicians, history professors, theater, drama professors, people who really had very little idea of the content, but they were interested in learning and wanted to know more, and that was really what we needed to work with. What I found so fascinating, there were two approaches we used. One was to try to get them up to speed on the content, although that wasn't our primary task. The primary task, as we saw it, was to get them to understand that the only way to make Iraqi students understand human rights was to model it in the classroom, because they were living in such a violent environment. This is an environment which for a while had improved and now is lately much more like it was in 2008, 2009 when we were doing this. The professors would get threats, death threats about the grades they were about to give. Students would be threatened and harassed. There were frequent sightings of killings and bodies. Blood was everywhere. They lived in a very violent world, a very violent community, a government and a society that was coming apart violently. So for them, human rights is ridiculous. It has no meaning at all, no content at all. And so our primary task, as we saw it, was to try to get the professors in a country where the method of teaching was to read from the textbook for an hour and then give the students a test that reflected what you'd read. And the textbooks were years and years old. Very, very rote memory focused and very, very professor as autocrat dynamics in the classroom. Our task was to get these professors to understand that if they could model human rights in the classroom by using student-centered learning techniques, that would make human rights feel real to them. Because for that hour or so in the classroom, it would be a different environment than the rest of the country. They would understand what it felt like. And they sort of got it. You know, we could explain it to them, they'd be like, oh, okay, that makes sense. But you have no idea how hard it is, because here in the US, this is old hat. It very, you know, we've been doing this for years, thinking about child-centered learning and all sorts of interactive techniques, and never just lecture, use all kinds of different tools, podcasts, movies, newspapers, all sorts of reports, and this and that, and field trips. And those were all completely radically new in Iraq. So new, in fact, that to this day, I believe, this hasn't really loosened up all that much. The mechanism for even getting a guest lecturer in your class was that you had to go all the way up to the dean of your college to get permission to have a guest lecturer. And it was a big deal. It wasn't just like, oh, sure, whatever. Like, who will it be? What will they talk about? You know, I don't know. It's not, that's pretty crazy stuff, having a guest. So, you know, having to go through the hoops of doing creative types of out of the classroom teaching was really hard for them to think about. Even harder for them to think about was the fact that they might concede a little of their authority in the classroom. So we really had to work hard to give them comfort and for them to understand that focusing on student experience in the classroom wasn't handing over control, you know, that they were still empowered to make sure that things functioned smoothly, that they could step in if arguments were beginning to develop in an unproductive way, and that they were still really in charge of the classroom, but that it was okay for students to run portions of it. It was okay for students to be speaking a lot and for them to ask a lot of questions and for them to be present and alive and active during the sessions. That was quite a long process for them to figure out. And I think over time, we worked intensively with them 3 different sessions, 3 different workshops outside of Iraq. And we gave them assignments and homework, and they talked to us about it, and they came up with some really innovative stuff. I mean, I'm quite impressed by what some of our professors were able to do, given the institutional constraints in the Iraqi higher education structure. So we had some professors, we had one professor who was a lawyer who got her students to take theater roles. She wasn't even the dramatist, she was the law professor, who had her students enact a version of a historic trial having to do with a woman accused of murder, and, you know, talking about the various rights of representation and gender. And it was a big theatrical production. She made it, and she had a video of it. She was so proud of what her students had been able to accomplish. Very, very unusual in the Iraqi context. We had one really creative professor, I thought, who gave his students disposable cameras. And their assignment was to walk around and take photographs of what they thought were abuses of human rights. Now that's a little risky in the situation that they were dealing with it in, but you know, they weren't supposed to be invasive, but to try to sort of capture what they were witnessing on an ordinary day, not going to the scene of massive conflict, but really everyday things. And so we got back photos of child workers, of poverty, of conditions that just were inhumane, and not war, not violent, not shooting, not the U.S. Marines. We got back ordinary life photos that you could get here in this country. We had another woman who had a very touching story of bringing her classroom to a juvenile prison so that they could see the conditions and see that these were young people their age being locked up, and find out what their stories were. And in fact, it moved the students so much that when they found out that their counterparts in jail were not getting education, were basically locked up and with nothing to do. They had some concrete play yard for an hour a day or something, but nothing no lessons, nothing to write with, no materials for education or learning. So they took up a collection and got them notebooks and books and pens and pencils so that they could at least do some sort of learning inside the prison, because that's the sort of thing that the government wasn't going to do. So we got some really, really innovative stuff from the Iraqis. And I actually want to do something really subversive and to suggest that American professors who want to teach human rights could actually have something in common, could actually share some lessons learned from the Iraqi professors. What could you possibly have in common with these professors? And I would suggest to you that it is the challenge of making human rights feel relevant. It's for the opposite reason, not because it's not irrelevant in America because it's so violent it doesn't seem like it has any sway at all. It's relevant because students here are so convinced that their lives are guaranteed to be secure. That human rights seems irrelevant to them. They don't feel like they're ever violated. If they are, they don't think of it in terms of human rights. They think of it in terms of the United States Constitution. U.S. institutions, U.S. laws get violated. International standards don't get violated in the United States. Right? Yes, they do. You know that. Now, I should have prefaced this by saying these remarks are mine, not USIP's, which does not adopt policy positions. But in any case, I really do think that it's a challenge for us to pop the American bubble, to think about making human rights relevant for Americans here in the United States. And also foreign students. I know you teach a lot of foreign students as well. Also foreign students who think that when they come to the U.S. they leave their troubles behind, or that the U.S. is different and they come here and it's all very comfy and we have access to so many material and creature comforts and everything seems fine and orderly. And so they're not trained to look beneath that surface either. So I still think that it's a challenge in this environment to kind of strip that away and see what's really going on. And I furthermore would suggest that you really try to reorient the attitude and the approach to human rights to be one that starts at home. You should start with human rights violations in the United States and then link them to the violations overseas, not the other way around. I think most of your students probably take your courses in human rights because they're interested in Darfur or Colombia, Venezuela, you name it. Wherever violence outside is happening, that's what they want to learn about. They think that's the interesting stuff. I want them to think about the violence that's happening here, structural and otherwise, and to see that first. When people come and ask me how to get started in conflict resolution, how do you get those skills? What does it take for, to get field practice, And I say, well, you could volunteer, not having any skill at all, and try to get yourself into Africa or Latin America or wherever. But frankly, you can have really, really marketable skills if you volunteer at a downtown soup kitchen or a youth program in the inner city. Because you get the same kinds of problems, and you get the same kinds of, you actually get real marketable skills right here at home, if you think about it. You know, we here in universities are elites. Some of us don't feel that elite. You know, depending on the paycheck and the student loans you might be burdened with, you know, you don't feel more or less elite, but we are elite. So there are plenty of people who are much more challenged than we are. And I think there are a number of ways. I mean, we've already heard some suggestions. I love that you take your students to the Holocaust Museum and that you bring them to court cases. I think that's fantastic. I would recommend that you start bringing them to the cases on gay rights, equal pay for equal work. You know, the death penalty cases are fantastic for the United States human rights scene. I would even suggest that you bring the war right home to them by connecting them with vets, returned vets. Because unless you're related to a vet, you probably have never really felt very connected to all of the conflicts that the United States is involved in. And there are plenty of veterans organizations that would be happy to, I think, be asked to be talked to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, folks. I'm not going to rush on. Please allow me not to summarize all of these nice thoughts because I'm not going to do justice. So I'm going to open it up to you. Please introduce yourselves briefly, tell us who you are, and we can get as many questions as possible. I think we have about 15 minutes, so that's a good amount of time.
And if I can just add one thing I forgot to mention, you have these little pieces of paper on your chairs. If you decide that you have to leave early, please make sure to fill out your evaluation and leave it behind. Thank you.
Yes, yes, sir.
I'm sorry, I'm Andrew Breen. I'm new, but I'm teaching a class on organized crime.
It's okay.
Yeah.
You can be new.
Yeah, something new guy. But we were just chatting briefly on the way in. I just had a source book published by American Bar Association Center on Human Rights called the Human Rights Law Source Book. So we just did the kickoff at Center for National Policy, and I didn't want to miss this presentation. But something that occurred that came up in the conversation over at CMP at noon that I think would be valid for everybody in this room is UDHR also comes out in plain language version that has been translated into dozens and dozens of foreign languages. It was a program manager for NDI for Iran that said really tough to penetrate into Iran for programs they run, but would there be a way to see that in Farsi? And so I just think that one of the things that might be useful for making it relevant for students is get away from the article of UDHR, get away from the Rome Treaty, get away from EU interpretations of this versus. There's actually a plain language version. You print it out kind of like the document you had, and it's got a footnote right on it that says this is the plain language version. But I think it's an educational tool. It provides the framework for here are the standards that when they're violated. Because a lot of it, it's most foreign developing countries, and I'm an Iraq veteran myself, is educating about them when in fact they were having fundamental rights violated because they may not believe that individual humans have that value. So just the plain language version might be a good place to go if you're thinking about even how to put your arms around where to start finding a nexus with your class.
Thank you for the comment.
About a few resources. I wanted everyone's presentations were great, and I'm so glad you talked about relevance because that's really where it begins and starts, right? I talk all the time about points of entry, right? I had one time to go and meet with the vice chair of the Constitutional Court of Armenia to talk to this guy about gender issues, right? Okay. So at 10 o'clock in the morning, he greeted me warmly with a platter of vodka, and that was the beginning of our conversation. And I talked to him all about economic development for his country. I talked to him all about education. I didn't say one word about gender issues because I knew I would get about 5 seconds further before he got completely trashed with the drinking of the vodka. At least a little bit further by meeting him where he was at on the issues that he wanted to talk about, right? It's true with our students too. And I think that starting with human rights issues at home, Eleanor Roosevelt, human rights begins in places close to home, small places close to home, right? Starts right here. So meeting your students where they are, video clips, having them listen, not read, because that's where they're at. posting things on Snapchat that disappear in 15 seconds, and finding ways to engage them, but also on the issues that are next door to them or right in front of them that they don't see, and then relating them to these bigger, more global issues because they infuse everything. I think it's so very important. The other thing I wanted to mention was a few other resources, as Rick had kind of pulled some out. We published something called the Human Rights Brief, and there is the Human Rights Brief, and there is hrbrief.org. And these are, this is a journal that comes out a few times a year with short articles, 6,000 words and few footnotes, written in accessible language about legal issues, but written in accessible language. They're perfect resources for students anywhere. It goes out to about 4,000 people in 132 countries, and we've got a website that is even broader in its orientation that covers the Inter-American Commission for those of us with a Latin American bent. All of the open hearings of the Inter-American Commission are covered there in almost real time. And so it's a great resource both for your students, but also for yourselves in potentially writing about issues that you're interested in. Linda's going to write something, and she doesn't even know that. I'm going to hit her up in just a second. So there's that. Podcasts and webinars, our Center for Human Rights, which is all of our Center for Human Rights across the university. Right now, I got a list yesterday that we're up to 46 events this year so far, and we're just starting the second semester. Now, we don't have that many planned for second semester, but podcasts and webcasts of every single one of those events is available on our website, and those are great materials to assign or to look at or to learn from by yourselves that are related to all kinds of different human rights issues across the board. And then finally, there are a bunch of websites that have teaching materials for human rights. Human Rights Education Associates, HREA.org, has a bunch of online training materials, but they also have a fairly okay, if a little bit outdated, library of resources for kind of learning or thinking about, or at least some articles to start thinking about teaching human rights. The RFK Center for Justice and Human Rights, rfkcenter.org, has their Speak Truth to Power program, which has the stories of human rights defenders created into lesson plans that are focused for high school students. And we actually collaborate with them, and we train law students to go and teach in high schools, kind of peer-to-peer education. We work closely with the RFK Center. But they have a whole range of resources there that are really pretty good and are geared towards U.S. students. And then finally, Teaching History and Ourselves, which is a wonderful educational organization that deals with anti-genocide, anti-racism, anti-bigotry, anti-all kinds of things, and pro-good things. I don't want to be all anti. And they've got enormous resources there as well. That just scratches the surface of some things that are available to you all, to us all of us.
Can I just add a few things also?
Yeah.
I mean, to plug some of the work that Hadar does down at the law school. And one way I think that getting students in different disciplines more interested may be to have them be in the position to learn more about simply even the human rights lexicon. So, down at the law school, they do these munching on human rights things where they serve, pizza. Maybe they talk about economic, social, cultural rights. There's a Human Rights 101. A
brilliant Human Rights 101.
Sorry.
Brilliant.
And there's events, always events across campus that may involve issues that the students don't realize are human rights issues until they hear people talking about them. So, Hadar and I have been working with students, the Student Human Rights, it's been a long time since I've said it.
Collaboration.
Shrek.
Shrek. Student Human Rights
Collaboration Committee. Yeah. And so they're planning Human Rights Week this semester. That'll be from February 10th to 14th, just a little plug there. But we're doing it in a way that the students are bringing events that work across disciplines. So there's going to be a day that focuses on criminal justice, a day that focuses on environment, LGBTQ rights, etc.
Disability and the right to education. Those are the 5 days. Each day has a different theme.
There's the Human Rights series at the K Center. Joe Eldridge is here. I don't know if you guys know Joe, but so there's all these events also through that. Hadar and I have also worked with the students that she has down at the law school and students on campus here for these human rights coffee hours, where again, if you encourage students to attend these things, maybe they would start to hear these things framed in a way that then they could also engage with as well.
And just to move, because we have tried to engage faculty in this undertaking of bringing human rights home to this university and really bringing the pieces together. So many of us are doing human rights work in so many different ways. And it's been an interesting and challenging process in our somewhat decentralized university. I think that that's a good way to say it for the webcam. And so what we're hoping to do this semester is actually to include faculty who are interested in participating in this process with the student committee, to work together, to really plan for next year, to think about what we can do all together. And this has been something that's been so important because we have had the support of all of the deans of all of the schools. Helping to push this along and really wanting to see this happen. So I'm hoping that any of you who are interested in joining us in this endeavor will out yourselves to us at the end of the session.
If I could add just a quick postscript to this, and I wanted to also agree on the issue of engaging the students in what's in front of them here. We find that that really is the door that you have to open, is to show them what's here in Washington, what's here on the domestic front first. And I normally also say that if we don't deal with the domestic issue, we can't point fingers outside of our borders first. And so there are those things that have to be done. So I would suggest to those who are instructors in the room that for students who think that you're heavy-handed and too dynamic on this, because you will get some of that pushback too, is that sometimes when I feel that I'm in that space, then I offer extra credit for these things. Or for the Human Rights Film Series, then I'm not just offering extra credit, but maybe I am making an assignment, but let's make it a fun assignment, so go and write a film review. So some of those things you have to think about the assignment from the student's perspective and how you deal with the heavy issues, but how can you make it interesting to them? I think that that's really where you got to go.
We've got time to get through. I've seen a couple of times. Maybe not.
We'll collect questions or comments.
Well, I don't see the hands up again.
No more hands.
So if no more, then we can get you on last comment.
Well, I was going to
going
pick
to
up
close.
on something that Jeff had mentioned earlier, and a conversation that at my lunch table where we talked about what are the barriers to doing something. In our case, it was what are the barriers to critical thinking. But you made a comment about how if you care about these issues, you need to take some risks, you need to show some courage, and perhaps asking your department to support you more, or to change your syllabus in a way that allows you to incorporate the questions and issues of human rights in whatever way you want to do it. And I do think that as much as we are focused on teaching students human rights, one of the challenges that we have, and Hadar was alluding to that a little bit, is that we probably need to teach ourselves a lot more about human rights as well, and that many of the things that thinking about human rights is not a politically biased issue. It has nothing to do with politics. It doesn't mean that you're a bleeding heart liberal just because you're thinking about human rights. So even if that political position is one that is uncomfortable to you, you still have an opportunity to act in a way that is human rights friendly, if you will. So I would also encourage us to think about, should we be having lunch sessions like the Shrek group has? Maybe there needs to be more of that kind of informal exchange of ideas. CTRL has offered to, they have very limited resources, of course, but they have offered to put together some additional resources that can be used for building a syllabus around human rights, or incorporating human rights into one syllabus. So I would just encourage all of you here to
take the work that we're trying to do individually and say, go back to your departments, go back to your colleagues, go back to friends and say, let's have a conversation about this.
One last thing is that in our last meeting with all the deans in September, we actually decided, and Specs hosted the first of a series of faculty workshops that we are hoping to have each semester on a variety of different kinds of topics in terms of the integration of human rights into teaching. The one that Dean Wild put together was very much focused on that, but one that I hope and think is upcoming is about social media and the use of social media in your classes and in teaching human rights. One has been discussed about creating projects that academic research, grant-driven academic research in the field of human rights. And I can't remember what, because we're talking a year off, whatever. But there were a variety of ideas, and if you have ideas about what you think would be important in a series like that and ways in which we can reach your colleagues, we would welcome that very, very much. This is an open, transparent, participatory, respectful, innovative, and flexible process in which we find solidarity and participation among all. So we hope very much to involve you all in this process as well.
Thank you all. Thank you, Dean Wright. Thank you, folks.